Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in our series on Introduction to World Religions. Today, we'll continue with Judaism. Last time, we saw some of the introductory aspects of Judaism, the key features, the key concepts that are involved in Judaism. Today, we'll go much deeper and we'll take a look at the divisions in the Jewish society. Now, in the society during the time of Jesus, we see that the Jewish social structure was highly stratified. So, in a way, we see that there were clear divisions between the rich, the middle class, and the poor. So, in this way, we see that there were kind of clear divisions in society. Now, these divisions were based on wealth, they were also based on social influence, and religious roles. Now, they impacted not only one's economic status but also one's position in religious as well as public life. Now, when you look at the divisions in the society, you had the rich, the middle class, the poor, and then there were the others as well. Now, let's take a look at each of these divisions one by one. So, first you had the rich. Now, we see that the wealthy in the Jewish society, they occupied prominent positions in courts, and at the same time we see that they had significant influence both in public as well as religious matters. Now, they were the elites who had the financial means, and in a way they used to control the decision making, and also often they used to kind of dominate the legal and social structures. Now, we see that they lived in well furnished houses, and in a way, there was a display of wealth through their ownership of expensive servants as well as secretaries. Now, this wealth also enabled them to make large contributions to the temple. and they would offer often expensive gifts as a sign of piety and social standing. Now, a significant portion of the wealth of the rich families was also used for dowries for their daughter when they got married. And this, in a way, was a practice that, in a way, reinforced social alliances, and at the same time, it maintained the family's prestige. Now, who were the representatives of the rich? So, we see that the rich included prominent social figures. So, you had people like merchants who were wealthy traders, and we see that they were the ones who controlled much of the economy. Then you also have members of the Sanhedrin. Now, we see that the Sanhedrin was the Jewish council that was responsible for religious as well as civil law, and its members were often from the wealthy backgrounds. Then you also have the tax collectors. Now, these were often despised by the common people. Why? Because they were considered to be employees for the Roman authorities. So they were considered as people who work for the Roman authorities, and we see that the tax collectors got great wealth through their activities. And then you also have the families of the high priest and the priestly aristocracy. So these would basically include priests, particularly those in Jerusalem. And in a way, we see that they had significant among amount of power, and some of them were also very much wealthy, particularly those who were connected with the temple, because we see that they also managed the temple treasury as well as the offerings. Next, we take a look at the middle class. Now, when you look at the occupations, we see that the middle class generally composed of retail traders. Then you also had various craftsmen, and you also had other small business owners. Now, we see that these small business owners were the ones who actually worked in modest economic conditions, and they were not impoverished, but we see that they had a kind of a middle life, in the sense they also did not have the political influence or wealth of the upper class. Now, when you speak about the priests in the middle class, so we see that outside of the wealthy priests in Jerusalem, so among the rich, we had seen that there were also those who, in a way, belonged to the priestly aristocracy, those who had significant power, those who were connected to the temple. So we see that outside of this category of the wealthy priests in Jerusalem, we see that most priests belonged to this middle class. Now, they performed religious functions in local synagogues and temples, but we see that they did not have the wealth and power of the elite priest families. Next, we take a look at the poor. Now, the poor included slaves and laborers as well as people living in poverty. So, when we speak about the slaves and the laborers, we see that this was the lowest tier of society. Now, slavery was widespread in those days. So, it was a widespread practice, and we see that both Jewish as well as Gentile slaves existed in society. Now, we see that Jewish slaves had certain protections under the Jewish law, and we see that they were often not bound to perform menial tasks, unlike the Gentile slaves. Now, we see that these slaves were also considered as private property, and they could be auctioned in the market, but they also had the possibility of redeeming themselves. In other words, we see that they could buy their freedom or be freed under certain conditions. Now, when we speak about people living in poverty, so we see that the poor in the Jewish society also included a wide range of marginalized individuals. Now, let's take a look at who were the people that came in this category. So, in a way, you had beggars, and we see that many lived in poverty, particularly in urban centers like Jerusalem, where we see that beggars were a common sight. Then you had workers and the unemployed. Now, we see that many people lived precariously without stable employment. So, these were the ones who did not have a stable source of employment, and therefore they had to, in a way, depend on the daily work for their wages. Then you also had the disabled. This would include the blind, lame, crippled, deaf, and these were the ones who were unable to fully participate in the economic and social life of the community. And then you also had the economically poor, which basically were individuals that lived on the fringes of society. So we see that they had limited resources and had little social mobility. Next, there were the others, also were part of the Jewish society. So, in a way, we see that they were the scribes, and we see that the scribes, in a way, were an essential part of the Jewish society, and they were responsible, in a way, for copying as well as interpreting religious texts. So we see that even though they were not wealthy, it was considered meritorious to show hospitality to scribes, as they were regarded as important figures in religious life. Next, you also had people living in chariots. So you had a very small group who lived like nomadic or semi nomadic lifestyle, and they, in a way, went about moving in chariots. Next, let's take a look at the religious life of the Jews. So we see that the religious life of the Jews was very much centered around their deep relationship with God. Now we see that God was known by the sacred and ineffable name Yahweh. And therefore, Judaism's religious framework is built on strict monotheism. And here we see that this is strict monotheism with an unwavering belief. So they have a very strong belief that there is only one God. And this one God is not only the protector of Israel, but he is also the protector of whole humanity. And in this way, he is also the protector of widows and orphans. Now, this belief in Yahweh sets Judaism apart from other religions. In other religions, we have gods which have distinct functions or realms. In Judaism, we see that God is Lord of all things. In a way, God is the source of all creation and protection. Now, we see that in Judaism, there is an unshakable belief in the oneness of God. And in a way, we see that there cannot be another God. At the same time, we see that any idea of multiplicity of gods is rejected. Now, this principle of monotheism is a core feature which defines Jewish faith and, in a way, makes a distinction or distinguishes it from other polytheistic and other idolatrous practices that were found in the neighboring cultures. Now, we also see that God is, in a way, the protector of humanity. And therefore, when we speak of God as the protector of humanity, we see that God for them is not just a kind of a distant or abstract, but we see that God is actively involved in the lives of humanity. And as we have seen, there is a special concern for the vulnerable. So we see that the Jewish God is, in a way, seen as a defender of the weak, which includes widows orphans, and the marginalized. Now, this idea of a compassionate and protective God is fundamental to Jewish religious and ethical life. Now, let's take a look at God's revelation. So, we see that in Judaism, God reveals himself to humanity in various ways, and these revelations are how, in a way, God communicates his will, guidance, and plans to the people. Now, when you look at some of the ways, the mediums through which this revelation takes place, so one of these is through dreams, omens, and astrology. So, we see that in ancient times, priests often consulted God through various techniques such as interpreting dreams, omens, and even astrological signs. Now, these were seen as instruments or tools through which God would reveal his message to the people, particularly when direct communication was not possible or was not evident. Next, you also had prophetic revelations. So, this basically included visions and also listening. So, God Himself revealed Himself through prophets who would receive visions and they would also hear the word of God. Now, these prophets were in a way intermediaries. So, in a way, we can say that they were bridges between God and man, and they would, in a way, help in delivering messages of guidance, warning, hope, and in a way, they would communicate the message from God to the people. Now, this prophetic tradition is very central to Jewish religious life. You have prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, who were significant figures who communicated God's word to Israel. Then you also have the apocalyptic rev- revelation. So, here you have the revelation of mysteries. So, God revealed Himself through various apocalyptic visions, and these unveiled mysteries that were related to the end times. Or it sometimes also was regarding the unfolding of divine plans. Now, these revelations we see were often hidden or symbolic. So, they would, in a way, involve hidden or symbolic meanings. And this would ultimately point to God's ultimate control over history, as well as his divine plans for redemption and judgment. Next, we see that God's compassion and saving power. So, Judaism also emphasizes that God is a compassionate and a saving God. Now, we see that the book of Exodus is seen as a prime example of God's intervention in human history. And here we see that God's saving power is revealed through the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And this event is central to Jewish theology, as in a way it demonstrates God's concern for the oppressed and God's role as a redeemer. Now, when you look at God's plan, we see that through his acts of salvation, God also reveals his plan for humanity. So, he is not a distant deity, but in a way, we see that he is actively involved in guiding and shaping the course of human events for the benefit of the people. Now let's take a look at certain expression of Jewish beliefs. So we see that Jewish religious life is deeply expressed in their prayers and rituals. Many of these prayers and rituals are often captured in the Siddur, that is the Jewish prayer book. Now, the Siddur often contains prayers that reflect Jewish public piety and religious beliefs, and this in a way offers a way for the community to unite in worshipping God. And in a way, it also helps the community to turn towards God with humility and devotion. Now, when we speak about personal and communal piety, we see that these prayers are not just for the rabbis or for the theologians, but for every person who seeks to approach God with a humble heart. And this reflects the idea that religious life in Judaism is both communal as well as personal. In a way, it involves every believer and his ongoing relationship with God. Now, when we speak about the sacred books of Judaism, we see that these sacred books play a very important role in the religious, moral, and legal life of the Jewish people. And in a way, they form the foundation for Jewish law, tradition, and worship. Thus, we see that they guide both individual as well as communal conduct. And therefore, maybe we can break down the main sacred texts and take a look at the significance of each of these texts. First and foremost, we take a look at the Torah, which means law or instruction. And we see that it is the most sacred and foundational text of Judaism. And it consists of the Pentateuch, which involves the following five books. So we see that Genesis covers the creation of the world, the covenant with Noah, as well as the patriarchal stories, which includes the covenant with Abraham. Then you have the Exodus, which in a way narrates the story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt, their liberation through Moses, and also receiving the new law on Mount Sinai. Then you have Leviticus, that contains laws regarding worship, sacrifice, rituals, as well as rules for cleanliness and purity. Then you have Numbers, which also describes the Israelites wandering in the desert, and the preparations to enter the promised land. And in a way, Deuteronomy repeats the law, and it focuses on the covenant and its renewal. Now, this is the time when the Israelites prepare to settle in the land of Canaan. So, we see that the Torah is said to be divinely revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, and it is regarded as the written law that regulates all aspects of life. So, it is not just a legal code, but it is also a spiritual guide which in a way encompasses moral, societal, and religious obligations. Then we see that the Torah also is closely tied to the covenant between God and Israel, in which we see that God chooses the Israelites as his people, and he, in a way, sets down commandments that they must follow in order to maintain their special relationship. Now, the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments are part of the Torah, and they are central ethical instructions. And we see that these instructions summarize the fundamental demands of human morality. Then you have the law of Moses. So the Torah also covers human institutions like the family, society, and the economy. So it also has strict guidelines for worship, rituals, and cleanliness. And therefore, the laws of the Torah are seen as distinct from other legal codes because they are believed to come directly from God. And in this way, this makes them sacred and binding. Now, in ancient times, we see that the priests were the custodians of the Torah, and they were responsible for interpreting of the laws and conveying the teachings to the people. And this would ensure that all the obligations that the people must follow are followed. Then you also had the Mishnah, which is the first major written collection of Jewish oral traditions. And we see that this is a critical component of rabbinic Judaism. So it was compiled somewhere around the 2nd century CE, and it serves as a kind of a law code, and in a way it expands upon the written laws of the Torah. So now we see that structure wise the Mishnah is divided into 6 major parts called as seders or orders, and these cover different aspects of life. So when you look at the structure, we see that you have the agricultural law, which basically includes the laws concerning crops, tithes, and the relationship between land and the people. Then you also have the Sabbath and the festival laws, that are regulations for observing Sabbath, as well as the Jewish holidays. Then you also have the family laws concerning marriage, divorce, and other familial obligations. Then you also have various civil and criminal laws. These are the laws governing property, personal injury, and criminal behavior. Then you also had sacrifices and the temple law. So these were laws with regard to the sacrificial system and the temple cult. And then you have the purity laws, that were laws concerning purity and impurity. And therefore, we see that the Mishnah serves as a basis also for later rabbinical discussions and interpretations of the Jewish law. And therefore, we see that it becomes a key source of Jewish legal tradition. Next, you have the Talmud. Now, we see that the Talmud is a central text of rabbinic Judaism, and it consists of two major parts, that is the Mishnah and the Gemara. Now, we see that the Gemara is a detailed commentary and explanation of the Mishnah, and together in a way they form the oral Torah. Now we see that the Talmud also serves as a comprehensive guide for interpreting Jewish laws, and it covers every aspect of life from legal rulings to the ethical behavior and theology. So in a way there are two versions of the Talmud. So you have the Babylonian Talmud, which is more authoritative and widely used, and then you also have the Palestinian Talmud. So the whole purpose of the Talmud is to explain the Mishnah's laws in greater depth. They are also meant to provide context and debate from various rabbinical authorities on how to apply these laws in daily life. So it gives a context, and also they kind of debate how and in the best possible way, which is the best possible way in which these laws can be applied to daily life. Now let's take a look at the purpose of the Torah and the sacred books. Now the Torah is more than a set of laws. It is viewed as a way of God that prepares the Jewish people for salvation and wisdom. And therefore, by following the laws of the Torah, people are put in contact with God, and they are expected to live in a way that reflects this covenantal relationship with God. Now, there are several key functions of the Torah. So first and foremost is liberation. So this is especially in the context of the Exodus. So this is seen as, the Torah is seen as a tool of liberation, and it provides the path for the people to be freed, not only from physical oppression but also from spiritual bondage. Then wisdom. So the Torah also teaches the Jewish people how to live wisely, justly, and in accordance with the will of God. And we see that when we speak about the covenantal relationship, these sacred texts are also important for understanding the covenant between God and Israel. So we see that the priests would interpret the Torah to make sure that people remain faithful to God's commandments. So they would explain the Torah to the people, interpret it, so people know what they need to do to faithfully follow the commandments of God. Now let's take a look at the impact of the Torah on Jewish life. So we see that the Torah covers almost every aspect of Jewish life, including law on family. You also have law on society, on economics, as well as with regards to worship and ritual purity. And so these guidelines in a way permeate all level of existence. That means right from personal ethical conduct to communal religious observance. So in a way it is both part of the personal as well as communal life of the people. Now the 10 commandments or the decalogues also provides a moral and ethical foundation for all people, and this helps to regulate the fundamental duties towards God as well as other human beings. And in a way, we see that the Torah's laws and the sacred books as a whole set the Jewish people apart from other nations. So, the laws are in a way not just mere legal codes, but they are divine instructions. And these, in a way, create a unique identity for the Jewish people as God's chosen people. So let's take a look at some of these writings in short, in a summary. So as we have seen, the Talmud is a collection of ancient rabbinic writings, and it in a way consists of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And in a way, it also constitutes the basis for religious authority for traditional Judaism. And as we have seen, there are two versions. You have the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. So the meaning of the word Talmud itself is learning or instructions. Next you have the Mishnah, which is in a way the first section of the Talmud. And it consists of a collection of oral interpretations of the rabbis on scriptures, and it was compiled in the year around 200 AD and written in Hebrew language. Then you have the Gemara, which is the second part of the Talmud, and in a way it chiefly consists of commentaries on the Mishnah. So the language of the Gemara is Aramaic, and it was compiled in the year 450 AD. And you have the Midrash, which is a type of interpretation, or it is a typical way of interpreting texts. It was done by a group of Jews for the Hebrew community, and they commented on the Hebrew scriptures. So this was written somewhere around 400 to 1200 AD. So that's it for this episode. So we have seen some of the Jewish writings, some of the sacred texts, as well as we have seen the divisions in the society. Next time, we'll take a look at the prophets and some other interesting aspects of Judaism. So thank you and see you next time.